The following presentation is a gift from the team at Streamline Publishing, publishers of Fine Art Connoisseur, Plein Air Magazine, and weekly newsletters Fine Art Today, Realism Today, Plein Air Today, and American Watercolor, and events, the Plein Air Convention and the Figurative Art Convention. We offer over 400 different art instruction tutorials and ultra high-quality video by the world's leading artists. If you like what you see, help us support our artists and our team with your purchase. Each video aired has a special discount code for today only in the comments section with a link to the video offered. And to see everything we do, or if you want to receive notice of new releases, new products, and new events for artists, simply click the other link, which says, "See everything we do." Thank you.
Hi, I'm Eric Rhodes with Plein Air and Fine Art Connoisseur magazines, and I'm using this time to learn and to grow and to stretch myself to try new things. One of the things I've been experimenting with lately is watercolor, because oftentimes if I'm traveling to Europe or some other place, it's a little bit of a hassle to take my oils on the road because sometimes I can't find turpentine. So I'm trying to learn more about watercolor, and I thought those of you who are into watercolor or those who might want to learn more about it would want to learn from the best of the best. And this is Thomas Schaller. I hope you enjoy this segment.
Hi everybody, this is Tom Schaller. Some of you may know me and others of you may not, so welcome to my new video. I'm here in Austin with all these good people, and I'm going to be taking you through a painting. I'm an artist working in watercolor, but I think a lot of the things I'm going to be talking about are applicable or hopefully useful to any artist working in any medium. It's going to be a step-by-step, so I'm going to be talking a lot about how I do what I do, but a little bit about why I do what I do in the first place. So let's dive in and I'll take you through it. So we have one life. We have anything we want to do within reason. We're capable of doing it. So why is it some of us choose to paint and others choose to do something else? Obviously, I can't speak for anybody but myself, but I just think painting is a fundamental way of storytelling, non-verbal storytelling, much like writing or music, but it uses tools of visual language, of course, to tell the story the artist has. I come from a background of architecture and that form of design. I've learned over the years how to transpose design that I used to use in creating buildings and cityscapes for people into making paintings that are more personal. So what I'm hinting at is the building block in design that was missing in my former life of architecture and design was the personal, the expressive. That's a crucial element when an artist sets out to make a painting. Why do you do what you do? Is to tell a story about who you are and how you react to the world around you. I think it's the artist's job not to illustrate the world or depict it. We have cameras for that sort of thing, but it's to interpret it, to bring your own unique voice to whatever it is you do on canvas or, in my case, paper in the watercolor medium. Okay, one of the things I most like about watercolor, I've tried every medium, but for me, watercolor is, it works. It's the most personally expressive way for me to get from here and here to here. Other artists may work in other ways, I get it, but for me, watercolor is the most immediate, the clearest, simplest, most direct and effective way for me to get what I'm feeling and what I'm thinking onto the surface of the paper. When I set out to do a painting, I think the question I ask first, before anything else happens, is Why? What is the subject I'm choosing to paint, and why did I not choose something else? I can't answer that for you, of course. I shouldn't. I also love watercolor and art in general because there's no one right way to paint. I have my way, you have yours. I could never paint like you do, and you can't paint like me. Not because I'm so great, but because we're all so very different. Watercolor, I think, is so expressive of each artist's individual DNA. Your own unique artistic voice is yours alone. I'm here today to show you a little bit about mine. Please feel free to use anything I talk about or any of my techniques, but know too that these come from my own personal experiences. Yours may be very different indeed. The things that talk to me may speak to you and they may not, and that's good. So I'm going to be talking to you very specifically today about the kinds of things that resonate with me and how I transpose them into a painting. I think it's important to point out some of the obvious things about painting, and another reason I love watercolor. Clearly, you're painting on a canvas, a sheet of paper. It's a two-dimensional exercise. We have only two dimensions, width and height, whatever format you use. Everything else that happens on the surface is magic. I think anything we can do if we paint in a realistic or even semi-realistic way to imply three dimensions, depth, dimensionality in our work is to the good. It's at least something to consider, even if you're an abstract painter. I'm not a strict realist. I bring in elements of memory, time, and pure imagination into my work. But I am inspired by much of my site paintings and sketches so that almost everything I do has an element of realism or the real world in it, even though it's torqued and reimagined quite a lot. The subject I'm going to be talking about today is a very specific place. It's not made up. It's a bridge in Rome. I'm very much drawn to subjects of bridges, not just because they can be beautiful. You know, everything that's beautiful isn't necessarily pretty. Cameras can record beautiful objects, places, people, and things. It's the artist's job, I think, to bring some sense of interpretation to what naturally attracts him or her to paint that thing. So as the subject goes, if you paint from site observation, plein air painting, or in the studio, you look at the subject, and I think it's my job as an artist to then say, okay, that's what I'm looking at, but what do I see? Meaning, what do I feel about what I'm looking at? How do I take what I'm looking at and make an expressive painting out of it? Those are the why questions I was referencing earlier, and I'm going to show you a bit about how I do that. This obviously is a reference photo of the specific subject. It's the Ponte Vittorio Emanuele II bridge across the Tiber in Rome, Italy. It's just up the river from the much more famous Angel Bridge that you've probably all seen. So it's hardly overlooked, but it's not nearly as crowded or as photographed or as seen. It was built in the late 1800s. It's a very, very beautiful neoclassical structure, sure, but I really want to emphasize that I'm not painting so much the actual bridge. I'm trying to paint my reaction to it and what I bring to paintings in general, which is a sense of duality, two opposite things colliding on the sheet of paper I'm working on, meaning dark versus light, the vertical versus the horizontal, warm tones versus cool tones, man-made objects, as they collide with the natural world, and also a sense of time. I was referencing a minute ago how we like to play with the idea of perspective and dimensionality in a painting to get a sense of that 3D effect that can be very compelling. But in terms of subject matter, I like to do something that can imply yet another dimension, the fourth dimension of passing of time. A bridge is a slam dunk because you can imagine yourself in an image of a bridge walking across. It literally spans space and time from here to here. It pulls the viewer through. If the painting is effective, you can imagine yourself in the space, moving across from right to left or left to right. And it begins really not to tell my story, but to allow the viewer to picture themselves inside this imaginary world telling their own stories. I want to talk a little about composition, the composition of the painting. Some real fundamental things happen. Once you've decided on what it is you wish to paint, how do you then bridge that gap into an actual painting? I think painting from photographs is very risky business. They're fine to have, but a photograph can tend to make the artist fall a little in love with all of the details, all the specificity, the specific colors, and the artist's license, the artist's job, I think, is to take what he or she looks at and decide what can you leave in, what can you leave out. That's the essence of what design is. Design is choice. What do you put in the painting? What do you choose to leave out? If you're an architect designing a school building, for example, you're going to use different materials in a different manner than you might if you were designing a place of worship or a courthouse. If you're a great cook, which I certainly am not, you know that if you're baking a pie, I guess, you're not going to put every ingredient, every spice in that pie. You have a sense of the intent of that pie, so you're going to put in only the spices and the ingredients that are going to make a great apple pie. Same thing with a good building, the exact same thing with a good piece of music, the same thing exactly with hopefully with a good painting. I look back at some of my older work, and I'm a little stunned at how sort of overworked they looked. I used too many techniques, too many colors, too many gimmicks or tricks. As I paint more and more as the years go by, I think I've learned how to edit out or to be more selective in what I choose to use in terms of techniques and colors. As few as I can use, the better, just enough to tell the story that I want my painting to tell. The very first thing in terms of composing your painting, once you've decided what it is you want to paint and you have some idea of what it is the story that painting is hopefully going to tell, what's the hook? What's the hook for you emotionally? What is it that made you want to paint this painting in the first place? This is what you want to try to get across to your viewer. Not to tell them what to think or to preach to them or be too editorial, but just that sense of your personality will speak to them silently about theirs. There's a connection in a good piece of art, I think, between the personal and the universal, something that almost everyone can relate to, and as well as something more intimate, something more personal that resonates with what you put into it as the author, as the designer of that painting. So if I set out to do a bridge, for example, first thing I need to decide is, how do I want to compose it on the sheet? I think a lot of us reflexively tend to paint in the horizontal format, whereas others of us tend to always paint in the vertical. Neither one is right, of course. I think it's worth taking just a second to decide, when you've decided upon your subject, which format is going to be best for you. A horizontal format tends to pull the viewer through the painting, left to right or right to left. A vertical format tends to pull the viewer's eye and their spirit up and down through the painting, from top to bottom, bottom to top. This sets up connections. This is yet another contrast, another duality I like to play with. A vertical painting will subtly, in an unspoken way, connect the earth to the sky. That tells a very different story than a horizontal painting, which tends to connect left to right primarily. Sky and earth can be in that, but they're supporting cast members, if you will, secondary players. The star of the show is the movement through the painting left to right. So since this is a bridge, it is kind of a slam dunk for a horizontal painting. There are beautiful vertical paintings you could do of this, but I think in this particular case, they might look a little forced, a little awkward. I think going with a nice, natural, horizontal composition is the way to go. There is water, there is sky, there are background elements. There are lots of things going on here, but the real star of the show is the rhythm of darks and lights that pull you through this painting left to right. I don't think it's absolutely necessary, but almost always I do a little sketch like this, a value study, compositional study, before I start the painting. The reason is it sort of sets in place my reaction, the stuff of art. What is it that excited me about this subject in the first place? Why did I decide to paint this as opposed to going out drinking with my friends or staying home on the couch? There was something exciting about this. The sketch for me is the quickest, most immediate, less pedantic way that I know of to get it down quickly. And I have stacks of these sketchbooks at home that I'll go back to days, weeks, months, even years later, and I'll look through and they'll bring me right back to wherever I was and say, oh wow, that's what I felt. That's my reaction to whatever that subject was. I will do a final painting far more from a sketch like this than I will from a reference photo. In fact, in my teaching and my classes, I will say to myself as well as my students, once you get a decent study sketch done, you can take your reference photos and throw them away. You don't need them that much. This is where you want to live. You want to start to live here. I also think a sketch tends to loosen us up. It sort of breaks the bounds between that reality that you're looking at and this reality that you're going to paint. That's a fundamental thing. It was an aha moment for me when I realized that. And I think it's a fundamental thing for students of art to realize that a good painting does not have to copy or replicate every single thing you see. It has to be a work unto itself. This is what people are going to look at, to assess, to judge you by. This is the genesis of art, not the reference photo, not even what you're looking at when you're painting in plein air. So that's one reason why I think the sketch is so critical to me. It also is a laboratory where I begin to get my thinking out of the way. I begin to establish, as I said, the format, of course. I set up, in this case, a nice sort of golden mean, the rule of thirds. A third up from the bottom is, in this case, the horizon line. A third of the way in from the left side is a larger area of darks, and that's a very comfortable composition of elements and shapes. The first line I draw on every drawing, every sketch, is this, the horizon line. It's the datum line that sort of begins to establish where you're standing in space to help the viewer feel, draw them into your painting ultimately, and help you as the artist begin to establish and set all the other various elements. The main thing the sketch does, besides that, it starts to tell you where do you want the areas of dark, where do you want the areas of light, also what is important, what must you put in this, what can you sort of play down or leave out entirely. In my work as an architectural watercolorist, I didn't have the liberty of leaving anything out, really. It was a very detail-oriented profession. Fine art, by contrast, you can leave out vast swaths of detail. The viewer's eye will fill in great blanks. It's really a bit like music. The parts of the painting that are unpainted are just as powerful as the parts of the painting that are painted. And that's poetry, that's magic when that happens properly. Those kinds of decisions, you can start to compose the design in the sketch even before you start the painting. So for me, again, these sketches are a laboratory. They take a lot of the guesswork out when I go on to the final painting. Someone once said, or maybe I just made it up, but you should try to get your thinking done first before you do your painting. That's another reason I do these sketches. This is where I try to get my thinking out of the way. Then when I jump onto the final painting, I can paint much more from here, from the heart, and not think too much. I think if you plan slowly and paint fast, something somebody else said, that often almost always results in a much freer, more expressive painting than if you stumble through and have to stop every 5 seconds and try to figure out what it is you're doing. One last thing is characteristic of watercolor, the light. All the light we have is already painted for you. I always hold up a blank sheet of paper to my classes when I'm teaching and say, oh look, you're half done. And I know it's a joke, but it's kind of true, because all the paint you put on this subtracts away. I call watercolor a subtractive medium, in that all the light that you're going to need in your final painting is already there. It's on the white blank sheet of paper. What you do as a watercolor artist is subtract away from that total amount of white by painting in just the shades and the shadows, which means that the dark areas of your painting have to be thought about carefully too. They can have so much luminosity, especially in a transparent medium, but you have to plan carefully where you want the whites, the lights of the painting to remain in the final painting. Another reason why the sketch is helpful, because it helps you establish where you want them. Once the light in a watercolor painting is gone, it really is time for cocktails, because you're done. You can regain some lights. You can scrub and scrape. I'm not a purist. I don't mind bits of opaque paint added. Not at all. I do that. But they're never going to have the sort of freshness and luminosity of a watercolor where the whites are preserved and saved from the outset. So in terms of composition in design, those are the main things that go through my head. This video is about designing your painting specifically. But when I talk about design, what I'm referring to is the creative process I think all of us go through, whether we're designing a building, growing a garden, making a painting, composing a piece of music, whatever creative exercise you're involved in, the act of design comes into play. And when I refer to design, what I mean, it's the creative process of choice, of deciding what elements you're going to use in painting, which techniques you're going to use, what colors, etc. In other creative mediums, what ingredients do you use? What do you choose? What do you choose to leave out? Once you have the idea of your painting, for example, in mind, you start to subconsciously even begin to think, what are the colors that are going to best sell this? What's the format that's going to best make that story come across? Etc. You begin to ask yourself these questions, the answers to which will hopefully make a stronger painting than if you don't ask those questions. Also, in terms of design, I think you need a hierarchy of elements, components. What are the elements that make a good design? I can't tell you what yours are, but I will talk to you about what mine are. I really encourage all of my students to listen to what I say, reject it if it doesn't make sense to them, and make up their own list. What are the elements for you alone, that make a good painting, that will help you design your best, most powerful painting? For me, there are 4 primary components. The first is the intent, meaning what is it you want this painting to say? Even more fundamentally, why are you doing this painting at all? What's the purpose? What are you trying to say? What do you want the painting to say to your viewers? The second element then, once you have your intent, the purpose established, is the composition. If you know you want your painting to be more linear or more vertical, that starts to tell you, before you draw or paint a thing at all, you begin to compose the painting in your mind, and then eventually, very quickly then, within your sketchbook. The third element, values. The poor people that take my classes, I know, get very tired of me hammering away on them on values, but I just don't think in the act of painting there are fewer things more important than a good dynamic range of values, from your lightest lights to your darkest darks, midtones in the middle. Again, I'm always harping on this, but it's a flat sheet of paper. There are numbers of ways of establishing depth, dimension within your painting, but the layering of 3 coherent values, lights, midtones, darks, is probably, for me, the best, most expressive way you can have to get a sense of 3 dimensions and dimensionality and depth that pulls the viewer inside and literally through your painting. I should say, it doesn't mean all of your darks, for example, have to be in one place, nor your lights nor midtones. In fact, you can orchestrate them through your painting to set up some kinetic energy and some dynamics that pull your viewer through and around, but they should be organized. I'm lucky, I'm fortunate in that I'm asked to jury a lot of shows, to judge other people's work. It's an honor, but I hate it. I hate to be that guy that says in or out. But on the other hand, I don't think there's any more harsh critic of our work than ourselves. That's true for me. So when I look back at my own work and I critique it, what I often see lacking is that dynamic sense of value. A good understanding of, comprehension of a successful dynamic range of values in a painting will go so far into making it a better painting. What I find lacking in so many of my earlier paintings is the technique may have been okay, my execution may have been all right, but they looked a little flat, a little monotone, because I didn't yet fully have a clear understanding of how important that dynamic value range. Those values are up to you, the conductor, if you will, the artist of your painting. If you want the painting to be more expressive, you can extend that value range from really rich darks to very bright, pure white. If you want your painting to tell a different kind of story, a little bit more personal, a little quieter, a little bit more contemplative, perhaps, you can narrow that range from a gray to an off gray. Even so, even within that, you have a dynamic range of values. The difference is the story that painting tells will be a little different. I could go on and on about values, but that's the basics. We'll be talking about it as I start painting more. But the fourth, final, last but not least element of my design component list is color. When I say that in groups, I hear a lot of gasps because everybody loves color. I do too. I do think of myself, to be fair, as more of a valuist painter, less about color, more about value. Value is critical in a painting too, though, or it can be. I think value pulls the emotional weight in a painting, or rather, value pulls the narrative weight through a painting, whereas color pulls the emotional weight. Not every color works in every painting. That's why I put it last on the list. And I often think you can get by with fewer rather than more colors. Like most artists, I think I can't go into an art supply store without adult supervision because I want everything I see. I want every color, I want every brush, I want everything. The truth is, one of the beauties of watercolor is you need so few materials and elements to do a really good painting. And no more so is that true than in color. I'll go into color in much more depth when I start painting, but I put it last on my list of important design elements because I think a painting is successful only when color is in service to value, and where a good value range is in service to a strong compositional sense, and when your composition only makes sense for the intent of your painting. So it's intent, composition, value, and color. Materials. One of the things I think I like most about watercolor is counterintuitive to how many of us, including me, think. And that is that you need so few materials really to do a really knockout painting. I know I'm in love with art materials. I expect many of you are as well. But the truth is, you just don't need that many things. When you think about it, that's really a plus. I teach a lot. I teach a lot of plein air, and I think one of the mistakes I see people making, and I've made it myself, is by hauling everything you own out in the field with you. Meaning, by the time you get to wherever you're going to set up and paint, you're exhausted. I keep almost everything I'm taking with me on a very small backpack, and I'm always looking at ways to edit down the materials I take. That said, you do need some. Obviously, you need brushes, paper, pigments. Don't forget the water. But very little else is required to do a good painting. And even at that, fewer of those than you might think. I'm going to start off talking about the brushes I use, because obviously they're critical. If you are using a minimal amount of things, those few things you use have to be things that work well for you, for how you paint. And they have to be useful to you. I have at home probably no fewer than 30,000 brushes. I'm joking, I don't, but it looks like it. The truth is, I use maybe 10 to 12 at most at any given time. I do try out new things here and there, and I'm fortunate that people do give me brushes to try. But I just want to walk you through the ones I use most often and the ones I'll be using to do the painting I'm going to be doing today. I think it's critical for a watercolorist to not forget it's a water-based medium. So therefore, a brush that holds a lot of water that can cover a large area quickly is pretty essential. One or two so-called mop brushes are, for me, indispensable. I really love this company, Escoda, a Spanish company. It's basically a mom and pop store. They largely hand make all of their brushes, but these are Squirrel Mops, so it's squirrel quills. Why these are useful is because, as I say, they can hold a ton of water. You can cover a large area. The worst thing that can happen is if you're trying to do a big, large, wet wash, if your brush runs out of paint halfway through and you get unnecessary or unwanted scrape marks or dry marks or have to scurry and re-wet your brush. So a brush that can hold a lot of water, cover a big area, is important. So Squirrel Mop by Escoda, I recommend highly. Another great thing about these is despite their high quality, they're really not that expensive. Another alternative are these Soft Aqua brand by Raphael. They're a type of mop too. I like quite a lot. They're not squirrel hair. They're not natural bristles at all. They're synthetic, but they're engineered so that a few bristles inside are coiled in such a way that they hold a lot of water as well. I guess overall I would prefer the all-natural squirrel brushes. They just behave better. They do tend to hold more water. They're beautiful. I don't own any Kolinsky or Sable brushes, to be honest. I find them, they do hold lots of water, but I find them a bit soft. They're also incredibly expensive, and I'm led to believe that they don't harvest the Kolinskys necessarily in very ethical ways. So the Raphael Soft Aquas, obviously being synthetic, don't hurt any Sables. I'm also led to believe that the squirrels for the Escoda mops willingly donate out of altruism their little tail hairs for these, so no squirrels are harmed in the making of the Escoda mops. Keeping in the Escoda family, their mops are the Aquario series. They make this versatile series of flats, rounds, etc., and mops that are also great. They hold a bit more water than a purely synthetic brush. Although they are synthetic, they do also replicate a natural hairbrush. Anyway, for me, I think it's important to have a mop brush, a big, wet, sloppy brush that can hold a lot of water. I tend to work pretty wet. A couple of these larger brushes. These I got in China. They're made by Black Mice. They're natural squirrel hair too, so obviously hold a lot of water and are great for doing very large wet washes. And this by the Paul Rubens company, I also got in China. Also similar, hold lots of water. I didn't ever use flats until a couple of years ago. Again, I was in China and somebody gave me as a gift a series of flats that I thought I wouldn't use, but now it turns out I do. Watercolor is so much about edges that a big wet brush like this that holds lots of water, of course, isn't especially adept at making clean, crisp edges. It's really outstanding for wet work. A flat edge brush, of course, is much more capable of striking a clean or hard edge or dry brush work, which I love to do quite a lot. So I do recommend having a couple of flats of different sizes. I like these Escoda Versatiles. They're great. I have a number of those in different sizes. And then moving down the road here, these Perla series, also by Escoda. They're all synthetic, nothing natural in them. They're rounds. They make a lot of different brushes, but these Escoda rounds are especially good at holding edges, detail work, and I really couldn't paint without them. So I have a series of those from 12 down to a number 2. I have a couple of other specialty brushes, but those are the basics. And I'm asked often if I had to choose just one brush, could I do that? just do a painting with one brush? Yeah, and I suppose I would choose a round number 12. It's an all-round workaday brush that you can get most everything accomplished with one or two brushes like that. As I start painting, I'll be talking about a couple of these specialty brushes I use, but they're not really necessary. They're just fun for me to play with. So that's a look at the types of brushes that I'm going to be using to do this painting. For the record, they're pretty much the same types of brushes I use at home for almost every painting. Depending on the physical size of a painting, that might dictate the physical size of the brush I might use. So for large studio work, I have very large examples of these, etc. But in general, I would recommend everybody have at least one natural hair squirrel, probably a squirrel mop for big wet and wet washes, maybe a couple of flats for edge work and dry brush work, and then a series. You could get by with 2 or 3 rounds for more line-based work or detailed work. I think if you have even 6 of those brushes, you'd have plenty to do just about any kind of painting you want to do. Another thing I'm asked about all the time is if you had to pick one material that you think makes the biggest difference in how you paint. That's a difficult question, but I suppose I would say the choice of a good piece of paper can make all the difference. I have seen painters with great skill be very disappointed and fall pretty flat by choosing a really bad or a student grade piece of paper. Watercolor paper, I understand. It's expensive. It can be. But overall, it's not that bad. You can buy a good quality paper for a fairly modest price. This is an Arches paper. People ask me a lot what paper I use, and there isn't one single answer. It does depend on the kind of painting I'm doing. This, as I say, is an Arches paper. It has a modest degree of sizing in it. I chose it because it's bright white, and because of the sizing, it'll hold an edge very neatly. The subject I'm doing lends itself to that. I also like Saunders Waterford. It's a beautiful, sophisticated paper, but it's a little softer. So the pigments tend to mix in the fibers of the paper a little more than they do on the Arches, which tend to stay up on the top a little bit longer to make a little cleaner edge. I also like Fabriano Papers quite a lot. They have a whole range that are worth looking into. But a good everyday, workaday world, good quality, 100% cotton, mold-made paper is this Arches, 140 pound. I use the rough surface and the bright white. I don't recommend using very heavy or 300-pound papers much. Now again, I'm not going to tell anybody what to do. Depends on how you paint. I find the heavier papers tend to soak pigments in, and over a little time, the painting becomes duller and more flat, whereas the mid-weight, thinner papers tend to hold the vibrancy and the values of the colors and the pigments as you put them on over the life of the painting a little bit better than the thicker papers. Again, though, that's a little bit of a function of the way I paint. I think I mentioned, but I almost always use rough surface paper. That is because I'm always looking for ways to amplify that sense of luminosity and depth in my paintings. So because of the kind of pigments I use, which I'm going to talk about in a second, they tend to hit the surface of the paper. The heavier parts of the solution of pigment and water sink into the little valleys of the paper and float over the little mountaintops, and then you get that beautiful characteristic shimmer that you can only get in a watercolor medium. It's both beautiful, characteristic, and it also helps amplify that sense of luminosity and transparency that I'm always looking for. So not always, but I almost always choose a rough surface paper, almost always 100% cotton. People do amazing work with UPO and all sorts of other paper, and my hat is off to them. I've not found any success in doing that, but there's always room for experimentation. Today, though, I'm going to be painting on this Arches 140-pound rough, bright white surface. Obviously, you need something to carry your pigments in and something to mix them in. I have an amazing palette. It's made by Steve Finelli at House of Hoffman. I got this to use as a studio palette because it's really a jewel and a work of art. They're all handmade and they're beautiful. But I love it so much, it's the only palette I use, indoors, outdoors, teaching, at home. It's been around the world a million times, and it's never let me down. It's made out of brass, but surprisingly lightweight. I'm not pushing these to say you should go get one, but I'm just saying it's important to choose a palette that holds enough pigments for you, sufficient amount of pigments, and has enough reasonably deep mixing wells for you to do your thing on the painting. I notice a lot of palettes, mixing wells are very shallow, so it's difficult to mix up a big vat of paint sufficient enough to cover a large area. And some palettes for me just simply have too much going on. I like the number of mixing wells here. I'm always trying to edit my number of paints down. I think I have 14 in total. I'd be happy with 10 to 12, but there you go. And I think it's important for me to have at least 5 mixing wells, and this has 6. So I love this palette, but by all means you should use whatever works best for you. And make sure you have a travel palette if you're interested in plein air work that's comfortable, that you can carry around with you, that's not too heavy and not too cumbersome. You can see here how I have my paints arranged. Generally speaking, they're arranged from lightest pigments to darkest, and from warm colors to cool. As far as specific pigments, I always use tube paints as opposed to cakes, because you can get really rich, vibrant colors with a lot of water. I mean, I never forget it's called watercolor, and I find a lot of people in my classes are a little stingy with either water or color. I think the tube-based pigments help us loosen up, paint much more fluidly and expressively. I use pigments mostly by Daniel Smith. They make more pigments than I can count. They're sort of a small one-off business. They care very much about art and about artists, and they respond very quickly to what artists are looking for out there in the real world in real time. And they make an exquisite range of pigments. I favor sediment-based colors as opposed to stain-based colors, which means I tend to avoid a lot of the quinocridones, the perylene colors, Windsor blues, Windsor greens. Not that they're not beautiful colors, they are, but I choose ones that favor sediment a bit more than staining because they mix well with other colors. You'll see soon the way I paint is fairly wet, and I want mostly pure colors to mix not in the palette first, but on the surface of the paper. So I will run complementary tones of color together on the paper to mix to form my neutrals, my grays, and my complements rather than pre-mixing them in the palette. If I use sediment-based colors, they tend to run on the paper a little less than a stain base, which is going to spread a lot more. So they stay a little bit more where I put them. They also are heavier, I mean physically heavier, so they sink a little quicker into the crevices of the paper and give that characteristic shimmer that I was talking about a little bit more easily than a stain-based color, which is literally going to just stain the surface of the paper regardless of how textured it may be. I mean, now obviously every pigment has a little bit of staining capacity in it, so don't get me wrong. But the more earth-based colors, umbers, siennas, etc., are obviously a little earthier, a little more sediment-based than staining pigments. I'll be talking about my color theory in a minute, but generally speaking, I try my best not to think about my pigments as color so much as temperature. They're either warm or they're cool. They're either light or they're dark. When I mix these in the palette, you'll see that I mix them from a light to a dark, always in a complement, and a mid-range to a mid-range, also always in a complement. I can talk specifically about what colors I use. Again, this is not a recipe. I urge you all to find which colors work best for you, and mine tend to change over time. I have a signature palette with Daniel Smith, but I frustrate them a lot because I'm always changing things out. But I have a Naples yellow, a French ochre, a raw umber, and a Van Dyke brown, which is a bit of a specialty that I don't always use, but there it is. A cad orange light, a cad red light, a Holbein pigment, which is called light red, burnt sienna, alizarin red, another Holbein color, lavender, which I love. It's a semi-opaque. I use it very sparingly. You'll see later. Cobalt teal, a manganese blue, a cobalt, and an ultramarine blue, a serpentine, and a jadeite green. This is an Imperial Purple, and a neutral tint is my darkest. So there's no white pigment, there's no black pigment. I'm not a purist. I'm not against using those. If they work for you, by all means, go for it. When a painting is done, I may add little highlights of opaque white, just as small details. I don't have a problem with it, except that mixing an opaque and a transparent medium can look a little awkward if you don't do it sparingly. So I don't carry them in my palette. I like to favor transparency, light fastness, which I learned the hard way. Rose Madder Genuine, I still love it, but early on in my career I painted a lot with it, only to find that it would fade quite quickly over a matter of just a few months. So sadly I've had to forego Rose Madder, although now they make an imitation Rose Madder, so who knows, I may go back into that. I used to never use green pigments, but Daniel Smith makes such beautiful ones I've given up and gone over. I don't mix my greens anymore. I use beautiful sediment-based serpentine and jadeite, which as they dry, they separate out into literal minerals that separate on the paper, sink and blend beautifully. So I wanted to talk a little bit more specifically about color and my ideas of color and how I set up my palette. It is not always the same, but I have to say 9 times out of 10, this is how I organize my palette. I've added water, as you can see, and mixed up wells of paint. I always do this. Not necessarily for these specific colors, but I always think it important to keep something wet in your palette while you're painting at all times. The very worst thing that can happen is if your brush goes dry and you stick it in your palette and there's nothing there. So it almost doesn't matter what color you use. As long as you keep your painting wet and alive, you're going to be okay. But back to my palette, how I organize it. Again, it's from lightest tones to darkest. Obviously, the white of the paper is the lightest value you've got. Second to that would be yellow, generally speaking. Even at really dark and intense hues, yellow is going to be about the lightest pigment that you can have. Second, I have a Holbein light red, which forms a sort of almost neutral reddish. It probably on camera looks a little brownish. It's not. It's much like a Venetian red, but it's not too bright. It's not too dull. And I don't even think of it as red. I think of it as a neutral warm tone. Its complement is a straight across home plate cobalt blue, which I pretty much always have in my palette. It's very easy to darken, to lighten, to cool down, to warm up. The same thing can be said for the light red. It's very easy to cool it, to brighten it, to lighten it, and to darken it. These are my mid-tones. The yellow forms my light. And over here is a neutral tint, which looks a little unky and black. It is not. It is really sort of a violet hue that, if you're clever, you'll notice is essentially a violet, which is a complement to my lightest light. So again, here I have contrast going. The light contrasted with the dark, the yellow as a complement to the violet, the orangish red as a midtone is a complement to the blue as the secondary midtone. So I have light, midtone, dark, warm, warm, cool, cool. This will form the basis for just about any painting you want to do. Obviously, I have supplementary pigments. When I do the final painting in a few minutes, I'm going to be using a more sophisticated, I think, palette than you see here, but the theory is the same. It's always about complements. It's always about how does the light complement the dark and vice versa, and how does the warm complement the cool and vice versa. I want to just do a couple of very quick, just sketchy washes on here so you can see what I'm talking about. As I say, I don't tend to use mixed pigments. I use a lot of pure out-of-the-tube color and then allow it to mix on the surface of the paper and within the fibers of the paper itself. So what I've got going on here is a Naples yellow, and then I'm going to transition it into this violet, which is actually a neutral tint. So because they're essentially sediment-based colors, I think you can see that the transition from yellow to violet, from light to dark, happens pretty rapidly and very smoothly. You do get a nice neutral in the middle, but I hope it's not muddy. It's still very transparent. It still transmits light and life, and there's nothing murky or dull about it. Moving into the midtones, this is the Holbein light red. You'll also notice I'm working pretty wet and at an angle. Another material that we have to use as artists, which I didn't mention because it's free. So far it's free. They haven't figured out how to charge us yet, but it's gravity. A lot of artists work with their paper just flat on the board or table they're working on, and I do find that a little surprising. If you work wet at all, it's the most natural thing in the world to allow the gravity of just tilting the board up a little bit to help these transitions happen more quickly, more beautifully, and more organically. But here I think you can see a warm transitions very quickly but very subtly into a cool. You get this beautiful neutral right in the middle without having to buy any gray pigment or mix up anything special in the palette first. It just happens organically. This light red cobalt is a combination I use constantly. I want to, right next to it, show you another one which is quite similar. This is burnt sienna, which is very similar to the light red, although obviously darker in value. It's a little more higher register. And then transitioning that into a ultramarine blue. So anyway, ultramarine blue and burnt sienna is a go-to complement that I recommend highly. I use it all the time. The effect is pretty similar to what's happening here. It's just at a higher register and a deeper value. But again, this this ultra blue can be lightened and darkened. It can be warmed up or cooled down. And the burnt sienna, same thing in reverse. It can be cooled down or brightened up, lightened or darkened very easily just by modulating the amount of water and the degree of pigment you use. But again, here's the transition from a darker warm to a darker cool, which creates this beautiful neutral right in the center. What I'm really talking about here is the power, I think the electric power of painting in complements, which is what I always do. I never think of one color, whatever it may be, without also considering what its complement is. Here's one of the most common complements. It's a direct complement, which is to say red to green. This is a dark, very sediment-based green, a jadeite green by Daniel Smith. Pretty dark, pretty intense if you don't use too much water. And then you can transition that into an alizarin crimson. And if you use less water and you don't want to use black pigment, but to have a nice or a gorgeous, emotive, translucent dark, these are two colors to consider. A dark green and a dark red will get you very nearly black and make some really, really lively neutrals and grays along the way. So there you have this beautiful dark cool transitioning into a beautiful dark red, making this nice complementary neutral right in the center. I love this composition or this combination. The last one I want to do it because it's what I'm going to be using for the painting that I'm going to be starting in a couple minutes. But it's what I like to call an off complement. It's a warm and a cool, of course, but they're not primary colors the way an orange and a blue or a green and a red or yellow and a violet. The palette I'm going to be using pretty much for the painting for this video is a little bit unusual, but it's one of my favorites. This is a cobalt teal or cobalt turquoise by some other manufacturers. This is a Daniel Smith. Obviously it's cool, but it's not strictly green, nor is it strictly blue. It's sort of a beautiful mid-toned bluish green. And then I'm going to be doing a lot of this transitioning into a violet. This is an Imperial Purple, also by Daniel Smith. obviously not a red, not an orange, but it's a warm tone. So this is what I call an off complement. It's still a warm, still a cool, of course, but they're not the primary colors, they're the secondary colors. Same thing happens though. You get this really nice transition from this brighter cool to a more dusky warm, but these beautiful complements happen in the middle. This combination I use a lot when I don't want color to take over in a painting, but I just want the values to read more clearly, or when I want a more atmospheric look. Maybe fog, maybe a rainy day, maybe a more atmospheric expression of refracted light, fog, rain, that sort of thing. I love this combination and I use it quite a lot. So those are just a few tips on color. Again, I urge you to just experiment. Find out what works for you. Again, I keep saying this, but it's no less true. There's no right answer. There's what's right for you. None of us paint like the rest of us. None of us hear color in the exact same way. Color doesn't speak to us in exactly the same way, and that's great. I use the ones that work for me. You're welcome to borrow them. I didn't invent color or water or any of these pigments. So anything at all that you find useful, have at it, and happy painting. Okay guys, so now it's time to get wet. We've done our thinking, at least much of it. I like to try to consider my sketch work and preliminary cropping ideas as the brain part of the painting. So much of my thinking is done. You know, again, I encourage you all to work your own method out. I think, for me, I tend to overthink things, over-detail paintings. So again, to repeat myself, doing these preliminary sketches is extremely helpful because I know immediately before anything gets painted where I want my darks, where I want my lights, where I want my primary and my secondary shapes, what I need to emphasize, what I need to play down, and essentially where I'm going. I call it my blueprint for the painting. So in short, it's a good idea to know more or less where you want to end up, to have a good plan to start with. But I have to say that within that plan, you got to build in the possibility, because it's a surety that some things are not going to go the way you planned. That's the beauty of watercolor. It doesn't do what you want it to do always. Actually, that's good. It's somewhat an unpredictable medium, and you can plan only so much. After that, you have to become comfortable. Just take a deep breath and let it do what it's going to do, because it is going to do it. Trying to corral, control watercolor too much is just going to result in a painting that looks a little stiff, obviously a little over-controlled, and possibly a little dry and lifeless. And we don't want that. So this painting I'm doing, as I discussed in the setup, has what I think is a nice mix of areas of control, detail, a little bit, and then areas of the opposite. Large washy areas with very little to no detail. And what I'm hoping, I'm pretty confident it'll work, is you'll see a nice mix of the man-made, the natural world colliding on the paper, and that'll be expressed through areas of some detail, some moderate detail, and some areas of no detail at all. All that went through my mind in looking at the scene and in doing the setup sketch. So briefly, I just wanted to reiterate the setup sketch. This black and white composition and value study is primarily what I'm going to be referring to as I paint. The reference photo, not so important. And right before I start, I wanted to say a couple of words about painting from photos. A reference photo, nice as it may be, is a different kind of beauty, I think, than we're trying to capture in a painting. It has a way of making all the values consistent. It has a way of making every detail, every item in the photograph have equal weight. And I do think it's the artist's job to take that in, consider it, and then reinterpret it into a painting that has a real focus, a real direction, and a real story to tell. So it's less observational, more expressive. So to that end, my reference photo, nice as it may be, I'm going to chuck it to the side for much of the drawing process and try to look at it very little at all. I'm going to be painting primarily from my value compositional sketch that I did earlier, because this captures my idea. This captures the essence of what I'm going to be trying to paint. Another thing about reference photos, they tend to, if you, in a landscape view like this, the sky, for example, is beautiful, but it looks very busy. And I just have one word of caution about skies in landscape or outdoor painting. If you put too much emphasis in the sky, it can tend to overwhelm. It can draw too much attention to itself. So I would say, unless the painting is about the sky, if it's a sky painting, by all means, go crazy. But if the sky is just there as a compositional element, play it down, knock it back, make it take its place as a background player. So that's another reason I'm going to keep my reference photo off to the side and not look at it at all if I can, or very, very little. This is my guiding light here. This sketch captures my thoughts, my ideas, my compositional idea, and the dimensionality and life, the story that I want my painting to tell. So I'm going to keep it up here and refer to it on occasion, though it's pretty much locked in my mind. That sketch gets me out of the reality of the observed world, but this painting will get me out of the reality a little bit of the sketch too, because this is what really matters. So now it's time to get wet. Typically, I can think of many exceptions to this, but typically I work my paintings up all at once. I don't allow them to dry in the middle of the process. I like each area of the painting to connect quite physically, literally, to the other area. So you have to think a little bit about drying times. Usually I work my paintings up from lightest areas to darkest darks. My whitest whites, I know where they are. I have them established in my sketch and in my mind. I know where I want to save whites and paint nothing at all. But the lightest tones is what I mean. The lightest tones first, the mid-tones second, and the darkest darks last. Generally, in a landscape view like this, the elements of the sky that you see are in the background, and generally speaking, they're going to be lighter. And so, not always, but very often I will do the area of sky first, and I'm going to do that here. The leading edge of the bridge here, I'm going to be wanting to save some light. So being a liquid medium, watercolor will tend to run downhill because I work pretty wet and at an angle. So I'm going to be doing the sky upside down. Again, this is something I often do, but not always, but often. The reason being, it helps you maintain an area of white if you need to. Also, you can work with gravity, the most free medium you can buy, to help pull the sky in the direction that I want it to go. So I'm going to start in here with my light tones, the background. If you look at the reference photo, you'll notice there's all kinds of buildings, some very famous, beautiful buildings, trees and things back here. But the story of this painting is definitely not the background. The story of the painting is the experience of this bridge and the pattern of lights leading you through under the bridge and then over the bridge. So this is the focus of the painting here, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a minute. But just in terms of the lightest lights, the background is definitely the background. You've got to keep that in mind. So all this stuff, all these trees, you can hint at, and I intend to, but the last thing you want to do is overpaint or over-detail them. So I'm going to start with a couple of brushes to get them wet and ready to go. One, a smaller mop brush that'll hold a lot of water. A slightly larger mop brush that'll hold a good deal of water. And then a synthetic mid-size flat brush that I'm going to use to just quickly cut in around areas of the bridge that I want to maintain as light. I have a palette in mind for this painting. It's a fairly busy painting. As far as a demo painting, it's much more complex than anything I've done before. I wanted very much on film or on video to do, a more proper studio painting. The things I've done earlier are really quite sketch-based, and that's fine, or plein air, which is also fine. But I wanted to let you guys have a look behind the curtain, if you will, on how I approach a real proper studio painting. So, you might think that the line drawing in this painting is pretty complicated, that there's a lot going on. You're not wrong. It is a little more detailed than most of the work I do, definitely more than I do on video. But I just thought it would be a nice change of pace to try to do this for you all to see how I approach it. I think the last thing you want to do is over-detail or over-draw your work. But again, as I said earlier, this painting is about the contrast between a little bit of area of detail and then a lot of areas of no detail. And I'm pretty confident that's going to make a lively and interesting painting. So, the palette I'm using, I've decided to use no real pure primary colors at all. So but I am using complements, as I almost always do. But these are what you might call off complements or secondary complements. So I'm using a Imperial Purple or a mineral violet, if you like Holbein paints. They're similar, very sedimentary, but very, very transparent, not bright acidic purple, but a nice, more neutral violet, and contrasting that with a cobalt teal, which is neither really blue nor really green, but somewhere in the middle. So anyway, it's a sort of more sophisticated palette, I think, this violet and teal that run together to give you this silvery feeling. I've started here a little bit careful to maintain a little bit of detail, or a little bit of line, I should say, saved light just above the bridge. And then once I get around the sculpture and all these things I maniacally drew, this is all going to dissolve into a very wet sky up above. So the square brush, flat brush, was great for me to just quickly cut in around the hard areas. Now I'm going to swap out to a mop brush. This is Skoda mid-size mop brush. I'm going to get away from the teal. I'm going to use a little bit of washed out violet. Timing is always critical, especially in watercolor, I think, because Obviously, you wait too long and what you've put down is going to dry and you'll end up with funny shapes or edges that you don't want. So for me too, connecting all things together is pretty critical. So now I'm just going into a pure, very wet, what you call, well, what we traditionally used to call a French wash, meaning you build up a bead of water and you pull it down the page. The painting is still upside down, of course, so I'm pulling it up the page, but in this direction, allowing the pigment and water solution to run down. And now this gray violet is going to transition into a Naples yellow. So obviously complementary tones, yellow and violet. But I don't want any hard edges. Again, I don't want any fancy cloud shapes to show in this particular painting, simply because I think they'd be distracting and really not add anything to the story. I'm getting lighter and lighter as I come up the page by adding more and more water to this soft brush. And essentially, that's all I intend to do for the background and sky. I will add just a hint of detail in some of these trees as they get closer to us, but not too much. I really want this whole area to fall back and for this entire area to read as a light wash. I'm more just hinting at mid-tone as it comes down closer to the light. On a big wet wash like this, I will, with a paper towel, just carefully mop the edges to sort of suction off the remaining bead of water. If I don't, you'll get backwash and end up with all sorts of funky shapes inside the wash that you probably are not going to want. Now, I can risk flipping this over while it's still really wet. It's a bit of a dangerous thing to do. If there were more pigment up top, that could run down and, again, make funny shapes. But it's reasonably light and it's still quite wet, so I think I'll be okay. The reason I'm doing that is because before this whole area gets a chance to dry, I want to take a round brush, one of these Squirrel Pearl synthetics, before this dries, and drop in a little bit more of the same cobalt and violet mixture to imply the distant trees. I want to do it while it's wet because I don't want any hard edges in the background. The last thing I want are hard edges back there. That is because a hard edge, I mean, again, there are a million exceptions, but a soft edge implies something far away. A harder edge implies something that's much closer up to us. And I, again, am always cognizant of trying to play up the sense of three-dimensionality in my paintings. It's a flat, two-dimensional piece of paper. So again, anything I can do to enhance the sense of depth is really something worth thinking about. So these are all really quite light, washed out colors, nothing too strident. Just a nice toggle, I think, between the cool of the cobalt, the warm of the violet, and then all resolving near the top into just a little bit of that pale Naples yellow to offset the violet that I put in the sky. This cobalt teal down here at the bottom gives a little weight to the sky, but also I think in a hopefully a little more sophisticated, a little bit more lyrical way implies the foliage of all these beautiful trees without getting too specific or without detailing them really too much at all. Could I come back later and paint in all those trees? Yeah, I could do, but I'd like to do it while it's still wet so that, again, everything sort of runs together and connects. I'm always looking for my paintings to connect. You can see here I'm getting a little bit of backwash where the sky came down. It's beginning to form some shapes. They're not bad, but if I don't want them, this handy little tool, this water mist bottle, is incredibly helpful tool to encourage your washes to blend together. And if you catch it in time, you see funny edges like that forming, they will magically vanish. So while any wash is still wet, it's still alive. So that means you have time to mess around with it and screw it up. It's a real skill to know when to just put the brushes down and back away. I don't know how to tell you how to learn that. I think it's just trial and error with the emphasis on a lot of error. Painting is so fun. I'm asked very often, how do you know when you're done with a painting? And the answer I usually give is, well, that's usually about a half an hour after I should have stopped. But what I really mean is when you hear that little voice inside your head saying, okay, maybe it needs just one more little thing, that's generally a clue that you should put your brushes down. In this video, I hope to be teaching you how to, well, first and foremost, how to just relax, enjoy the painting process. It's supposed to be fun. It's work, but it shouldn't feel like work. What I'm going to be teaching you is how to look at a difficult subject, or what some people might consider a really complex subject, how to think about it for a minute, break it down into its component parts of shapes, of dark and light. And if you do that beforehand, it's going to save you a lot of angst when you go to paint it. We're going to be looking at a lot of other things too: composition, perspective, color theory, etc. Ways to learn to face a complicated subject and make it seem much more doable and much more fun. I hope this video will help develop your skills, whether you paint on site or in the studio, to be able to quickly identify a subject that speaks to you, something you want to paint, something that you think your skills are best suited for, and how to make all those seemingly difficult choices very quickly right up front. What I bring that others don't quite as clearly is a real sense of contrast in my paintings. And I don't just mean light and dark, but I mean a whole approach to painting in terms of allowing opposites to interact on the surface of the paper and find a resolution or not, as a way of telling a story. Light versus dark, warm tones versus cool tones, vertical elements versus the horizontal elements. Watercolor for me feels much more rooted in emotionality and expressiveness, and I guess for me, honesty.
Well, that was Thomas Schaller in Watercolor, The Power of Design. Of course, you can use that design in any kind of painting. If you want to learn more about that video, go to lilyartvideo.com. Now let's learn more about Thomas.
I developed an interest in painting really early on. I developed an interest in art when I was about 5 or 6. My parents were, well, my father in particular was dead set against it. He didn't allow the word art to be spoken in the house. It's another story. But my grandmother was a big fan of art, and she snuck me art books. I was fixated on looking at compilations of the great masters, and especially American artists. I started drawing, I don't know, early. My mom said I was born holding a pencil. I don't think that's possible. It would be painful if it were. But I always drew as a way to design other worlds that I would rather live in, or that I imagined, cities under the sea, spaceships, fantasy worlds. In a way, nothing's really changed. I still do that. I think of painting, for me, as a natural extension of the act of drawing. So I started messing around with watercolors probably around the age 7 or 8, just because it was fun. It was a quick way for me to get my ideas down into a sketchbook. Later on, as I got a little more aware, I realized that drawing is a way of expressing yourself through lines, whereas painting is a way to express yourself through using shapes, shapes of light, shapes of dark, eventually shapes of color. So the answer to when I started painting was I just don't remember really much a time where I wasn't painting. It's what I always wanted to do, and it's a kind of a miracle. I feel very blessed that I'm able to make a living at something I always dreamed of doing. When I start thinking I'm losing an interest in painting, or I think I'm no good, which happens maybe once a week or so, I honestly, and I know this sounds a little bit glib, but to keep my interest in painting, I just have to sit and think just for a minute at the joy I had as a kid of painting and drawing and telling those unspoken stories I had in my imagination. It's really what drew me to painting at the age of 5 or 6, and it's what still, 50 years later, it's what still interests me. It's literally, and it sounds quite simple, but just literally the joy of being able to express myself, connect to others through the act of nonverbal communication. Nonverbal storytelling is something that I love. I think people very often, and rightly so, think of me as a painter of architecture or of the built environment. It's not wrong, because I made my living, commercial living, painting architecture, the visions of other people in New York for many years. I was always, even as a kid, drawn to drawing houses and buildings and cityscapes. But I think as I got more mature as a person and as an artist, I started to realize that buildings per se weren't really that interesting to me. I mean, I liked them, but what I really was inspired by was the uses of a building. What good is a building if not for the people that use it and interact with it? So as I became more mature as a painter, I started thinking of cityscapes and buildings really only in their context. How does a person react to it? How does a building make a person feel? How does a cityscape influence the lives of the people that live there? And now, at this point in my life, that's what I try to paint. Yeah, it includes elements of the built environment and buildings, as it always did, but I think it's much more a human experience. This is what I paint now, as might differentiate me from what I used to paint, certainly in my more commercial and academic days. I'm often asked how I would describe my style of painting, and it's sort of sticky. It's a good question, though. I think I stumble over it because I'm not really sure. My painting looks, it varies like all artists. I don't always paint exactly the same way, but in general, my painting looks realistic. It looks like it's of something, but it usually is. I think the important thing to know about my work is that it rarely is a painting of the subject. It's about the subject. And if you're doing that, if you approach even a very well-known subject in that manner, you start to incorporate elements of time, reinvention, memory, projection. So I could paint a very well-known scene in any city, for example, and I can work in bits of what I think it might have once looked like, what I might have read it once looked like or it felt like, and what also I imagine it could look like in 50 or 100 years. So if I had to sort of put a tag on what it is I do, I guess it would be called something along the lines of reinvented realism. I paint on location all the time, but I think it's important to point out I didn't used to. I used to paint only in the studio. I thought of myself as a studio painter only. When I look back on that, I realized why I was afraid of it. I was afraid of painting on site because I think I made the sort of rookie mistake a lot of us painters make, which is in trying to replicate what we do in the studio in the field. There are those who can do that, but I kind of tend to think of them as two very separate disciplines. They are very connected for me now, meaning my studio work is really highly informed by my plein air, my site painting, and my site painting is informed by my studio work as well. But I just think there's an immediacy that comes from painting on site that you really cannot replicate in the studio. The light changes, the noise changes, people talk to you on the street if you're painting in a city. All these outside influences, we try to control and keep them at bay when we work in the studio, but I welcome all that now. It helps me to become a better painter. It helps me focus on what I'm doing. I take all that in. I take all that stimulus in. I just take a deep breath and I let it out, and I try not to let any of it throw me off course. But if I'm honest, it actually informs how I paint. If I'm painting somewhere in a busy piazza in Italy, for example, the sights, the sounds, the noise, the people talking to me, the smells, all of that will change the kind of painting I do. It's a much more experiential painting style that I carry over into my studio work, or I try to, because I just think it makes the paintings that much more authentic, that much more grounded in experience than just something that you drag out of your head. I do paint in watercolor, and pretty much exclusively. That isn't to say I haven't tried other mediums. I have. I went through art school. I studied oil, pastel, acrylics, printmaking, sculpture, you name it. I've tried it. I've liked it all. I've enjoyed all of it. Watercolor for me, I've referenced it before, but I think it's just a natural fit. I think it's an extension of the act of drawing, which, if I'm honest, is my first and true love. I love to draw more than anything. But drawing with watercolor, if I can call it that, that is to say, expressing myself through shape rather than just lines, is such a perfect fit. Because it's a transparent medium, it helps me imply that sense of dimensionality and depth that I'm always going for. So watercolor it is for me. To me, it is the most expedient of medias. And I don't mean that it's just fast. It can be, of course. But I mean, it's a sense of feeling hardwired. Your emotions, your inspiration is hardwired straight from your heart through your arm onto the page. And I never got such a rush when I painted in oil, which seemed for me to be a much more studied, careful academic exercise. Whereas watercolor for me feels much more rooted in emotionality and expressiveness, and I guess for me, honesty. It's just the way to go for me. Painting, I think, can be scary for many of us, and I'll be honest, it's been scary for me, and it still is on occasion. And I think, without getting too heavy, I think it's just simply because painting's very personal. It's not something we necessarily have to do. There are those obsessive of us, like me. I have to paint. I don't feel like I have a choice. It's what I was put here to do. But that doesn't mean it doesn't scare me. And I think it's because if we want to become the best painter we can be, we understand that it transcends just mere technique. We've got to look a little deeper. We've got to peel back a few layers of personal crap or insecurities, and we have to be a little bit more honest. That was the big wake-up call I got when I transitioned from being a commercial artist to a fine artist. I naively thought, how hard can that be? I've been painting for 25 years. It was the hardest thing I ever did because I had to be honest. I had to, my paintings had to be just not of something, they had to be about something. And that meant I had to be willing to put something of myself, my own story, my own feelings on a piece of paper. So when you do that, naturally, and if you want to do it in public, people are going to judge you. They're going to look at you and decide if you're good enough, if you're in, if you're out, this show or that. So obviously that's scary. None of us, I don't expect, relish being judged. But I think the love of painting, the need to paint, the need to express yourself, I'm speaking for myself, I'm not afraid of being judged. I just take it as part of the way it is. It's okay. People can judge me, it's fine. Nobody is a harsher judge on ourselves, and I think I can speak for most all of us when I say ourselves. Nobody judges us harsher than we judge ourselves. So there's nothing to really be afraid of. Yeah, it's personal, but for me it's scarier not to paint than it is to paint and put up with other people's opinions. It's not a big deal.
Thomas Schaller is really a great guy. I hope you've enjoyed getting to know him a little bit. That's from his Watercolor, The Power of Design video, which you can learn more about at lilyartvideo.com. Remember to make good use of your time. I'm Eric Rhodes.
In this video, I hope to be teaching you how to, well, first and foremost, how to just relax, enjoy the painting process. It's supposed to be fun. It's work, but it shouldn't feel like work. What I'm going to be teaching you is how to look at a difficult subject, or what some people might consider a really complex subject, how to think about it for a minute, break it down into its component parts of shapes, of dark and light. And if you do that beforehand, it's going to save you a lot of angst when you go to painting. We're going to be looking at a lot of other things too: composition, perspective, color theory, etc. Ways to learn to face a complicated subject and make it seem much more doable and much more fun. I hope this video will help develop your skills, whether you paint on site or in the studio, to be able to quickly identify a subject that speaks to you, something you want to paint, something that you think your skills are best suited for, and how to make all those seemingly difficult choices very quickly right up front. What I bring that others don't quite as clearly is a real sense of contrast in my paintings. And I don't just mean light and dark, but I mean a whole approach to painting in terms of allowing opposites to interact on the surface of the paper and find a resolution or not, as a way of telling a story. Light versus dark, warm tones versus cool tones, vertical elements versus the horizontal elements. Watercolor for me feels much more rooted in emotionality and expressiveness, and I guess for me, honesty.